Aloha and welcome to this brief screencast on the Bowfolio system. In this screencast, what I want to do is take a really quick overview of the application structure and a little bit on the control flow. And for the most part, the application structure of Bowfolios is quite similar, or is based upon the application structure of Meteor application template React. So definitely check out that system and the accompanying video for that for maybe a little bit more in-depth treatment of the application structure, because that structure and the structure is based upon the current semi-best practice for Meteor applications, or at least the recommended way they like you to structure things. So let's get right down to it. You can see at the very top level of the repository when you download it, there's a .github directory that just contains an issue template. I have a .idea because I'm using IntelliJ IDEA for my editor, but you won't see that in the repo. And then you're going to have an app directory, a config directory, doc directory, again, is supplemental, .git ignore. Config.yaml is for the GitHub page. This is for IntelliJ IDEA. Again, more documentation is a license README. Okay, so the real stuff is basically, the real application is contained in the app directory and the config directory. The config directory contains settings.development.json, which, and I'll talk about this more later, contains the default data used to initialize the system. And the application directory is where the application resides. So we have our .meteor subdirectory, which contains Meteor-specific libraries. The thing you might want to look there is the packages file, which shows you all of the Meteor packages used to build this system. It's fairly straightforward. We use a roles package so we can have like an admin user if we want it. This is all just the core stuff. Also, in the case of this application, since it's prototyping oriented, we're loading the insecure package, which means you can do things like create or insert documents into your local mini Mongo database and have them propagated back to the server. It's very straightforward to remove this package and replace it by Meteor methods. In fact, as you'll see, we use Meteor methods in this application even though we have the insecure package loaded, because there's situations in which calling a Meteor method makes updates to a set of collections at once just way easier. Okay, and we have a client directory, which is the way by default in Meteor it kicks off the loading of code on the client side. It's going to look in the client directory and load the files there. Similarly, when it starts up a server, it's going to look in the server directory and start up things there. So that's what the client and server, and you can see they're very simple because mostly what they're going to be doing is importing files from this imports directory. And this is how you get kind of a lazy loading thing of not having to load all of the code for the system at once, and also provide some structuring and modularity. The imports directory has 3 subdirectories. This is also standard practice for a Meteor applications. The API directory, or you could consider this kind of the data model directory, contains definitions of the collections in the database, and this code is generally loaded on both the client and server side. And so you can see here we have a definition of a collection for holding the various interests that are defined in the application. We use simple schema and attach it to the collection instance in order to control the structure of the documents that are created. And in particular, this is an interesting one because you see for this interest collection, we are defining a primary key because of the fact that we're declaring that it has an index and that all elements, all the name fields have to be unique and distinct from each other. And this turns out to be super useful when we're trying to initialize the database from scratch, and I'll talk about that in the data model section. So anyway, you can see the profile subdirectory has 3 collection definitions. The projects directory has a couple. collection definitions. That's the API directory. And I'll do the UI directory next. So this is the user interface code. And basically the kind of the recommended practice when using really any layout, React or Blaze or whatever, is that you kind of break the system down hierarchically. You have a layout level, which is exemplified by this app.jsx, which says what's the overall structure of all the pages, or maybe some subset of the pages. And in a lot of cases, you have a overarching layout for everything, a single overarching layout for everything, called app. And you can see here what that overarching layout does. It says every page starts with a nav bar. It's followed by an interior section of the screen, which we call a page, and that changes depending upon the route that the user's at. And then there's a footer that's associated with every single page as well. So you have these two kind of constant components, the top and bottom, and things that differ in the middle. So the layout is at the top level. Then we have pages, and you can see basically all these kind of pages get, all these interior components are different pages, and they get loaded depending upon the route. And so we can go to, I don't know, the home page, and you can see this is a more traditional React component. And I'll go over the details of this page more when we talk about forms, because the basic idea of this page is to present a form. And then at a lower level than the page, things that might appear, or little pieces of page, little pieces that might appear on multiple pages are termed components according to this standard practice. So we have two components in the system, the footer and the nav bar. Then we also add a subdirectory called forms, and that's because we're going to use a custom form component that we have taken from the uniforms package and modified slightly to allow us to have a controller that isn't present in the standard uniforms package. And I go over this in more detail in Meteor example form React, and I just copied that directory straight from there. It turns out I don't even actually use this radio field controller in this application. I had just copied this code over. So that's the user interface section. And then the final section is the startup section, and this is where we can talk a little bit about the control flow. So as I said before, when you start up the system, when Meteor starts up the system and it starts up the server, it's going to look in the server directory and load whatever's there, which turns out to be this main.js file. And this main.js file says we want to load these three things from import startup server, and that imports startup server. As well as import startup both. So in the import startup server, we're going to load a file called publications, which defines these various publications names, and we're using the same name. In this system, it's very simple. We always publish all of the data associated with any of the collections, and obviously in most applications you're going to want to be more specific, or only publish a subset of the database of a collection to a client, depending upon what data they actually should be allowed to access. In this prototype, for simplicity's sake, I'm just publishing all of the data, which means I can have a very generic name for the publication. And so I just basically, when I define a collection, I define a string that names the collection, and I'm also using that string to name the publication associated with that collection. And that way I can just import a string from this package whenever I need to subscribe to something or reference the publication. It's real easy. The second thing that the main.js imports is this Mongo file, and what this Mongo file is going to do is essentially load the Mongo database with a set of documents that provide default data for all of our collections. And I'll go into this in more detail when we get to the data model section, but just to show you that that's, as we go through the control flow, that file is going to be loaded. The final thing that needs to be loaded on both client and server side, so it's in this import startup both, is this file called methods.js, and these are defining Meteor methods, which are basically remote procedure calls. So it enables the client to invoke some code on the server side and have the results of executing that code be communicated back to the client after it's done. And this just turns out to solve some problems when you try to update collections on the client side in insecure mode. So I define these Meteor methods. You can read about them in the Meteor documentation. I use the very extremely simple version of Meteor methods. But they, even in their simplest version, they provide a lot of benefits for situations like this where you see we are doing a lot of, we have lots of several different collections being updated in several different ways, and we want this all to be done at once. If you try to do this on the client side, you're going to have a nested callback situation, which results in very complicated looking code. So if you write a Meteor method, you can make all that callback complexity go away, and I'll talk about that in another screencast. So that's the control flow. That's how we start up the server. We're going to define some publications, load some code, and then define some methods so that when the client's going, it can call these methods. The final section is in the client side. So when we start up each client, we're going to load this main.js. And we're going to load on the client side this startup.jsx file. And here you see the classic code to start up a system with React, where you're just going to render the React app. That's the top level layout React component, and put it in this, this div element with the ID root, and you can find that right here. So that's how you get the React part of the system going. We're also going to load the style.css, and we got to load this methods file so that the client knows what methods are available and can invoke them. When you invoke the system for the first time and things are starting up, you're going to see a message kind of like this. You'll see junk, followed by this bcrypt thing, which you can ignore because we don't need efficient login stuff for the purpose of this prototype, and on Windows, it's been my experience that bcrypt can be a hassle to install. So if you just leave this, don't bother to do this Meteor npm install thing, you just get the error message and you ignore it, and then you'll also see that when we run the system for the first time, there will be the definition of default profiles and some default projects, and then these things will implicitly define some interests. So that's the basic application structure. I think I've gone through most files in the system, at least all the directories in the system, and how the system starts up. So I hope you understand.